One thing that's important to understand when it comes to commandments, because immediately, oftentimes, our minds just, we want to reject the idea of commandments and rules, of authority and obedience, right? Sometimes we have this somewhat immediate recoil toward that, where what you'll find in the lives of many people that the Bible talks about in its narratives, as well as the experiences of people throughout the history of humankind, perhaps your experience as well, is it's possible to come to a place where you love God's commands because of the recognition that while at times it may seem like on the surface they are not intended for our good, what you do find is that what God commanded is for our good. It's in regard to his best intentions for our lives. And that also takes into consideration this 10th and final commandment that we're going to look at today. How many of you ever looked at something and said, I want that? Right? Something that maybe somebody else had, that you look at that and you said, oh, I want one of those. How many of you have ever have had one of something, but then saw the one of that same thing that somebody else had that maybe was a little newer, a little better, a little shinier, little, I don't know, had a third camera instead of just two cameras? Right? I mean, it accessed the internet a millisecond faster than yours accesses the internet. I remember, I loved computers. As early as I could, I got my hands on a computer. I was a kid, and I had this little computer that didn't do a whole lot, wasn't capable of much, but boy, did I love that thing. And I learned, some rudimentary programming on that, and then eventually, that got exchanged for a newer computer. I happened to grow up in the era when home computers were at one time not a thing, and then they became a thing, right? And then quickly we saw technology evolve, and you couldn't keep up, right? I mean, it was very, very common to say as soon as you bought a new computer, it was already outdated, right? There was already the next processor that had come to market, that the processor in your computer was not as good as, right? And so there's always this constant race of wanting to kind of keep up. So I get that, right? There is this desire in us, especially in our world of progress, in our world of speed. It's easy for us to want and to want more. And it's that we're really going to kind of look at in this 10th commandment this morning. The commandment comes from Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, and it's written like this: Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So, simply stated, the commandment here is a prohibition on covetousness. That is, this internal desire to have what someone else has for ourselves. This commandment is unique from really pretty much all the others that we have looked at up to this point. Just quickly looking at kind of the structure of the 10 commandments, and sort of as a reminder of what these commandments were, we had 4 commandments that specifically related to our relationship with God and how we exist in that relationship with him faithfully. And then the other 6 were commandments that help regulate our interaction, our behavior with one another. How do we live in society among other people? The 4th commandment, the one to remember the Sabbath, might be considered by some as sort of a swing commandment, right? Because while honoring the Sabbath certainly has some relevance to how our relationship maintains its right standing with God through the honoring of this day, this keeping apart this one particular day in honor of God and as reserved for such things as worship and rest, as God modeled for us in his creation of the world. We find later on that the commandment was really made for us, right, for our benefit, that it has inherent benefit for us if we really, truly honor it. But let's just look real quickly here at the top 10. I divided them into the 4 and the 6. So the first 4, have no other gods but me. Do not worship idols. Do not misuse the Lord's name. And remember the Sabbath day, okay? I've highlighted the first one because when you look at the other 3, you can specifically read those and understand that they are regulating behavior, right? That there are certain either prohibitions or exhortations for us in how we are to live our lives. And the obedience to those commandments can be measured by what we do, by our behavior. The first one, though, have no other gods but me, is a little unique, right? We talked early on about how this commandment really sort of sets the framework for all the other commandments, right? If we put God first in everything, then really there's little else for us to worry about. But this commandment, this first commandment, really seems to speak kind of to the matter of the heart, right? As opposed to what are simply outward manifestations of our behavior. Now let's look at the last 6. Honor your father and mother, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not give false testimony, and do not covet. And you'll notice I've highlighted the final one there, the one we're going to talk about today. Do not covet. So 8 of these commandments are expressed through our behavior, right? But this one, the commandment to not covet, is similar to the first one in that it is expressed through the heart, right? There's no particular prohibition in terms of our behavior when it comes to coveting. I mean, there are certainly applications for how this commandment is lived out in our lives, but largely this thing resides in our hearts. And therefore, it might be the one that is the most easy to hide from the others. And therefore, because it's easy for us to hide, it may be one of the more easy ones for us to dismiss. I'll bet that for most of us, there's little problem with the literal commandment, do not kill, or do not murder, right? Although when we talked about that particular commandment, we saw how Jesus extended that commandment into the ethic of our internal lives, right? Jesus said, if a person is angry with his brother or sister, then he's guilty of this commandment in an analogous way to the person who actually murders another person. And so while all these commandments have something that's anchored in the heart, anchored in the internal, invisible parts of us, this commandment, do not covet, I think is often easy for us to just simply dismiss because we can hide it from our everyday behavior. And because we can hide it, because it's easy to dismiss, I think that it's likely one that needs the most attention. Now, the problem with covetousness is that covetousness exceeds the barrier of healthy desire, right? Ultimately, what is wrong with covetousness, the danger of covetousness, is that it exceeds the barrier of healthy desire. As many of you know, God gave us desires, and desire is a good thing, right? The fact that we want, the fact that we have something like impulse and desire for things, that's good, that's beautiful. That is a wonderful gift that God has invested into the experience of humanity. However, all of those desires that we have been created to have barriers, they have limitations. And the problem with covetousness is that it exceeds the limitation on our desires. There's a point at which our desires go over the line and become excessive, right? And that would be summed up in this word, covetousness. Have you ever met someone who could never be satisfied? You ever met somebody like that? It did not ever seem to matter how much they got, how far they could go. They just never seemed to be satisfied. They never seemed to be able to come to this place where they were content. There was always something to complain about. There was something always either that was out of place or that wasn't enough or that wasn't quite right. We often have a tendency of being that way when it comes to our desires, right? When our desires begin to move beyond the barrier that's supposed to govern and hold back into a healthy place what are our desires, then we find ourselves wanting more and more and more. And then we run into this problem, what I'll call the problem of more, right? And the problem of more is how much it costs. You see, more isn't free. More comes with a cost. More, in fact, comes with a great cost. You've heard the old saying that we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, right? Why do we do that? Well, we do that because we are often consumed with more. And ultimately, if we're to take this into the realm of our spiritual lives, our desire for more, our insatiable desire for more, that part of us that can never quite get to having enough, ultimately reveals that we are unsatisfied with God. Right? That is that we were created for God, and that our greatest desire, the greatest desire built into the framework of our humanity, is to be with and to enjoy God. But ultimately, when our lives are so full of dissatisfaction, what it's revealing is that, well, I'm not satisfied with God. Those of you who have at some point fallen in love, right? Maybe you fell in love with somebody at a particular time where you didn't have a whole lot, right? And so you just looked at each other, gazed into one another's eyes, right? Said to each other, we may not have much, but we have love, right? And love is enough, right? Because many of us, we've experienced that, right? The euphoria of being with another person, and it's just, it didn't matter, right? It didn't matter that, the entire exhaust system of the car was dropping out, right? And the doors were falling off, and the windows didn't work, and the engine barely run, if it ever started at all, right? And everything that we had materially would just seem to be in shambles, right? But we had love. And there's a sense in which we've been created for that kind of fulfillment that's found in God. And that ultimately, God ought to be enough. Not only does it reveal to us that God is not enough, but also that we are not satisfied with what God has allotted us, right? In this room today, there are people that have been allotted various ways of being alive. In terms of our wealth, in terms of our opportunities, in terms of our experiences, in terms of our relationships, right? We're all over the map here in our experiences, but we have each been allotted, so to speak, the life that we are living. And it doesn't mean that we don't have the power and the freedom to pursue maybe something that's better than what we currently have. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with living according to the desires of our heart, that such desires that fuel things like ambition, right? The desire, to do more, to be better, to have more. There's a very healthy way in which many of those desires can be lived out. The problem is that we have a tendency to move beyond to this place of excessiveness, and that even in our pursuit of maybe chasing something that we can never quite get our hands on, all the while we live in this state of discontentment, unsatisfied with what we have ultimately been allotted, right? And there's a sense in which some of what we have been allotted is out of our control. problem with more is how much it costs. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 13 to 15. Jesus is teaching on some very important things, and all of a sudden there's this outburst from the crowd. Verse 13, someone from the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Very interesting. We don't really have any sense of the extended scene here, but this outburst seems to be sort of without any real context or invitation, right? Yet it happened and it's recorded that this man demands from Jesus, right, who he perceives as somebody that possesses some level of authority, to convince his brother, right, who is apparently in control of an inheritance that has now been passed from the generation before to him, says, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Here's Jesus' response. "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Right? And so Jesus kind of dismisses the request to even proceed with the conversation or to try to ferret out the details of exactly what's happening within this family. Right? Jesus just simply says, "Listen, it's not my place. It is not my intention to sit as a judge or a mediator over this dispute that you're having with your brother." And then he turns his attention to those who were listening, whether it was the whole crowd that was there, including the man that had spoken out, or perhaps a smaller group of people. And Jesus said this, "Watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions." Right? So Jesus uses this outburst as an example to teach those who were listening a lesson on greed, a lesson on covetousness, because covetousness is exactly the thing that was being displayed by this brother. This little story, I think, reveals our tendency to be greedy for what we don't have. We don't know exactly, again, the details of what was happening and why there was conflict over how this inheritance was being divided. But what we do know is that this man that spoke to Jesus was greedy for something that he didn't have. And how often do we find ourselves similarly wanting, craving, greedy for the thing that we don't have? Now, he may have had a good point. We don't know. I mean, we have some understanding of how inheritances worked in ancient times during the time of Jesus. We don't know exactly the details or the dynamics of what was going on in this family. It's possible that he may have had a good point. Jesus doesn't even seem to be cared as to whether or not he was justified by it. Now, there's a good chance he might have been asking for something unjustly, right? I mean, he had the law. He had the laws of society that he could have appealed to if he had a real sure case for the inheritance being treated differently from how it was being treated. So there's a chance that the law was perhaps not in his favor, but whether it was or wasn't doesn't really seem to matter to Jesus. Jesus just immediately goes into this conversation about greed, right? The reality that this man wanted something that he didn't currently have. And I think that what Jesus wanted for people to understand, we're not going to read the rest of what he talked about. We've looked at the following verses. You can look at those later, but we've looked at those a number of times, right? Jesus tells a story about the man who had a great crop, great harvest, right? And his barns weren't big enough to hold it all, and so he tore those barns down. He built bigger barns, right? And so Jesus has a lot to say about our material possessions and our wealth, but ultimately, the problem with covetousness is that it costs us in worry, right? I told you, covetousness costs. And what it costs us in worry. If we use our imaginations for a moment, I wonder if we can imagine how much of this man's life was being consumed by his perceived injustice. I mean, perhaps you've been in a similar place where your heart has longed for, wanted for some particular thing that you couldn't quite get your hands on. And so you can understand how this man must have felt, and that is that his whole world had ultimately centered on, focused on, and became all about this inheritance that he didn't get. Right? And that little else about his life took on any meaning because the inheritance, it took over, right? This is the problem with greed. This is the problem with covetousness. This is the problem with having our eyes singularly focused on something that our hearts are going after. We lose perspective on everything else. How much of this man's life was consumed by this perceived injustice, right? I mean, it was certainly an injustice as far as how he perceived it. How, with regard to his mind, can you imagine how preoccupied his mind must have been? Of all the things that you and we have to think about over the course of a day, over the course of this next week, right? Of all the things that we have to manage with our minds. Like our minds, they're a limited resource, right? How many of you say, my mind is full right now, right? That's a lot of us. Like, last thing you need is another thing weighing on your mind, right? And so you know what it's like when your mind is preoccupied with something. It interferes with the ability to actually manage all the other things that your mind is responsible for. I can only imagine how debilitating it must have been for this man to actually take care of other obligations because his mind was just so preoccupied with this inheritance. Moving from his mind, we can look at his heart, right? What happens in the life of the person that is given to covetousness and greed is their hearts become burdened and grieved. This inheritance began to take on an emotional toll on this man's heart, right? You can see it as he cries out to Jesus, Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Is this conflict that he's experiencing, is it weeks old, is it months old, has it been going on for years? Who knows? Right? But the problem with covetousness and greed is that it has an emotional toll that it takes on our hearts. Think about his nerves. Right? Our nerves become subject to anxiety. I imagine he was jumpy, unpeaceful, like just unable to experience rest because he was so consumed with this thing he couldn't get. That ultimately would have effects on his physical body as well. I imagine many of us have experienced the toll that something like this takes on our bodies, where we become sleepless. I don't think they had blood pressure cuffs and stethoscopes to measure blood pressure, but you can imagine the angst that was literally coursing through the veins and the arteries of this man's body. And finally, imagine just how it affected his relationships. Why? Because covetousness, greed, it costs us in worry. And Jesus, what Jesus does is he invites us into life. Like what Jesus wants us to experience is living. Right? I mean, he excused the man's request by pointing out that he was not a judge or arbitrator over such matters as what he was bringing to Jesus. But ultimately, Jesus' concern was not for whether or not this man got what he was consumed with having, right? Jesus wasn't interested in this man's temporary happiness or temporary pacification for getting what he finally wanted. What Jesus was concerned about is what Jesus is always concerned about, and that was that this man live. I believe Jesus would invite him to come Forget about the inheritance and live. Take the life that God has given you and enjoy that life, which is impossible to do when our lives are consumed with covetousness and greed. Let's see how covetousness eats away at living. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 5, I want to read a few verses out of here, verses 10 through 12. Listen to what this person's observations regarding such things as wealth and material things and covetousness. Listen to his perspective on it. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10. The one who loves silver is never satisfied with silver. Just let that sink in for a moment, okay? Think about that. Think about whatever it is that your heart is chasing after, right? I got to think about the thing that my heart is chasing after, okay? And I can insert that here into the sentence and substitute it for the word silver, right? Because ultimately, whatever it is, materially or in terms of worldly things, whatever it is that we're chasing after, right, is analogous to silver. The one who loves silver is never satisfied with silver. That doesn't make sense. I mean, if I love silver, why wouldn't I be satisfied with silver? And whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with income. This too is futile. This observation is pointing out, which I think, something that I think we'd all probably tend to agree with, right? That if I chase after something like silver, well, I'm never going to get to the point where I've actually amassed enough silver, right? We talked about how the problem with covetousness is the desire for more, right? It's insatiable, right? We think, oh, I just need this much, right? And once I get this much, then I'll be fine. Then I'm all done chasing. But life teaches us, experience teaches us. I mean, we have a billion examples of how, you could say that, once you got that, then you'll be okay. Nobody is ever okay with it, right? That's exactly what he's saying here. The person who loves silver is never satisfied with silver. Here's the problem with covetousness and how it eats away at our lives. Covetousness is addictive. It's addictive. Covetousness never finds its end because there's always something more, right? There's always something more to get, and there's always something more to worry about. We worry about not having enough, right? Like, why this person who loves silver, why can they never be satisfied with silver? Well, because worry doesn't allow them to be. Worry is always speaking into our ears, well, that's not quite enough yet. Oh, that's not quite enough yet. Yeah, you're almost there. Keep going. We'll get there, right? But it's never gonna just. We worry about not having enough. And then if we happen to be lucky enough to get to that place where it's just like, oh, I can't take any more, then we start to worry about what we have. And so worry never lets us rest. It's been said that coveting is like seawater. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. When good things increase, the ones who consume them multiply. What then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? Here he goes on to talk about goods or good things, literally goods. Right? We're not talking about things that are necessarily unhealthy, necessarily like what we'd categorize as vices in our lives. We're talking about good things, goods. But when goods increase, the ones who consume them multiply, and we are left with this question: what then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? You see, what happens when our goods increase, so do the demands that we make on those goods. And at some point, what we have goes beyond meeting our daily needs and becomes more of just something to look at. There's a good chance that Many, perhaps most of us, have more than we actually need. And so when we get to that point where we can no longer consume, the only benefit that those additional things have for us is they become things for us to look at. And wealth is only an illusion with no real substance, right? A lot of people put their security, they put their trust in wealth, but the author here would have us know that wealth is just an illusion. Wealth is something that is sort of made up. It doesn't have any real substance behind it. And then we ultimately become overtaken by the costs of having that wealth, right? Because the worry that comes along with it, none of this stuff is free. And so therefore, he would conclude that we're no better off than we would have been without it. Covetousness is ultimately unsatisfactory, right? It doesn't actually satisfy us like we think it would. The writer goes on, he says, the sleep of the worker is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich permits him no sleep. Here, this contrast is made between the day laborer who works for his or her wages for that day. Those wages may or may not have been sufficient for the needs, right? This person is described as one that may have eaten little or may have eaten much, but ultimately, their sleep is sweet. But for the rich, the abundance permits no sleep. And so what we learn here is that covetousness is ultimately a burden. It's a burden. The desire for more, the quest for more, the greed sometimes that just has a tendency kind of slipping in and taking over, it becomes a burden to us. So covetousness costs us in worry. Now let me share with you 3 things that'll help for us to move away from covetousness into the way I believe God wants us to experience life. Let's start with the antidote to covetousness, which is giving. Giving is the antidote to covetousness. Giving brings joy, right? Where covetousness brings worry, giving brings joy. Many of you have heard what has become a common saying, right? But ultimately, its attribution goes all the way back to Jesus. Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Jesus is recorded as having said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Right? That there is happiness that comes with giving. There's joy that comes in giving that our covetousness can't, it has no means of reproducing. Imagine how happy it is for you to give something. Right? We know this. We know the happiness that we feel when we have released something that is ours for the benefit of someone else. How many of you experience happiness when you one-click on Amazon? Right? Isn't that great? Right? The thing comes up on our screen. Ooh, I want that, right? One click, and a day or two later, there it is at your door. Right? That makes us happy. But Jesus, according to Jesus, it's more blessed to give than to receive, right? That is that the little bit of happiness that you experience because you wanted that thing, you got that thing, you have that thing, you can actually multiply that happiness through giving. So give. Give to your church if you're not already. Give to something that is important to you, right? Something that you're passionate about. Give to that. Be generous toward others. Right? Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves the question, do I want the framework of my life to be one in which, it's about gaining and being served? Right? Is that what I'm looking for? I want to gain and I want for others, I want for this world, I want for the things of this world to serve me? Or do I, instead of that, do I want to give and serve? There's 2 very different ways of living our lives. Giving brings joy. Secondly, saving brings peace. saving brings peace. I want to encourage you to save. I want to encourage you from time to time to conserve. Right? Now, there is, of course, a kind of saving that becomes unhealthy that we might describe as hoarding, as setting up false security for ourselves, right? Not necessarily talking about that. But there is something wise and godly about saving. And the reality is, and we understand this very practically, that saving brings peace. How many of you have bought something and regretted it? Right? Now, where did the regret come from? The regret might have come from, well, I didn't actually have the money to pay for that, and so now I got to figure out how to pay for that, right? I went ahead and, I got that thing, and I didn't have the money to pay for it, and so now I have to make payments on it, right? And that's certainly something that is going to take a toll on our hearts, on our lives. Or there's I wanted that, but now that I have it, it didn't end up being as important or as joy producing as I thought it might have been. Right? So resist the urge to buy. Right? If I could just get you at some point in this next coming week to like engage the feeling of being about to buy something, wanting to buy something, and then not doing it, and just saving instead. Like if I get you to do that one time and to actually think of this moment, I'll feel like I've done something. Right? Because it's very unhealthy for us to just live according to our impulses. Right? Like that's the problem with the convenience that the marketplace currently affords us. How easy it is to get our hands on just about anything and everything that we want. There's a discipline that comes with saying, you know what? I'm not buying that. Or I'm not buying that right now. How many of you were around for World War I? Don't raise your hands. But during World War I, there was, of course, shortages, right, that were experienced. And so Calvin Coolidge encouraged the nation to practice meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. How many of you remember that? No, don't raise your hands. Right? Meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays as a way for the nation to collectively conserve, right? To be less of a burden on what was already great strains that were being experienced. He's famous for saying, eat it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Right? Saving brings peace. And then finally, contentment brings freedom. Contentment brings freedom. The problem with covetousness and greed is that we become slaves to it. And if covetousness chains and imprisons us to something like worry, then contentment, it brings us freedom. Well, how do we practice contentment? Well, we start by being grateful for what we already have. Of looking at, observing, and being grateful for how we have already been blessed. Be grateful for what you already have. You see, it's impossible for us to see what we have when our eyes are on something else. Remember that brother from the story. This brother that was probably incapacitated from experiencing gratefulness for what he did have because he was so consumed and his eyes were so set on what he didn't have. Do you have everything you want? Probably not, right? I'll bet there's even for the most godly in the room here, even for the person that's the most close to Jesus, there's probably a little room for, I want that. I want this. Do you have everything? Do I have everything I want? No. I don't think that we'll ever get to a place where we have everything we want or everything that we could want. And so realizing that, what we need to do is make the best of what we do have, right? Not only be grateful for what we already have, but make the best of it. Make the best of what we do have. Contentment brings freedom. And so, instead of prioritizing more things, prioritize better relationships. Think about the relationships in your life. And what does it mean for me to invest more in those relationships than just getting another thing or getting more things? Contentment brings freedom. Covetousness brings worry. Giving brings joy. Saving brings peace. And contentment brings freedom. I believe that's the life that God wants for us to experience this morning. Amen.